In a world brimming with distractions, where every moment is a battle for our attention, the mind finds itself trapped. It pulls us in one direction, then another, chasing fleeting desires, emotions, and experiences. The struggle is real, and it's something we all know too well. But what happens when that struggle becomes overwhelming? When temptations aren't just external forces, but deeply embedded within our own minds, shaping our thoughts, our actions, and our lives. Imagine walking through a bustling city street, flashing advertisements, the constant hum of technology, the pressure to fit in, to succeed, to be more. With every step, you encounter new desires: what to buy, where to go, how to feel. It's almost as if the world is designed to lead you astray, to distract you from your true self. And amidst all this noise, there is your mind, your thoughts racing, your emotions fluctuating, your inner world in turmoil. This is the modern struggle. The mind, once a tool for clarity and peace, now finds itself entangled in the web of cravings, fears, and distractions. It becomes difficult to separate what is truly important from what the world tells us is important. And in the midst of this chaos, the question arises: how can we keep our minds pure amid all these temptations? It's a question that has been asked for centuries, and one that lies at the heart of Buddhist teachings. In Buddhism, the mind is seen as the root of both our suffering and our liberation. When the mind is clouded with desires, anger, and ignorance, it creates suffering, both for ourselves and others. But when the mind is clear, calm, and centered, it becomes a source of peace and wisdom. The Buddhist path offers us a way to navigate this inner struggle. It teaches us that while we cannot always control the external world, we can control how we respond to it. We can train the mind to remain calm, even in the face of temptation. We can cultivate mindfulness to see things as they truly are, without being swept away by the tides of desire. But here's the thing: this isn't easy. The pull of temptation is strong. The mind is constantly in motion, reacting to the world around us, chasing pleasure, avoiding pain. It's like a river, always flowing, always changing, never still. And in that flow, we can easily lose ourselves. We forget who we truly are. We become so absorbed in the noise that we lose sight of the silence. Yet, despite the challenges, there is hope. The path to a pure mind begins with awareness, becoming aware of the mind's habits, its tendencies, and its reactions. It begins with recognizing that the mind is not just a passive observer of the world, but an active participant in shaping our reality. Buddhism teaches us that our thoughts and emotions are not fixed. They are transient, like clouds passing through the sky. What we experience today may not be the same tomorrow. And with this understanding comes freedom. The freedom to not be defined by our desires, our fears, or our attachments. We can learn to let go of what no longer serves us, to release the grip of temptation that clouds our judgment. But how do we begin this process? How do we transform a mind filled with distractions into one that is pure, clear, and free? In the chapters to come, we will explore this journey, step by step. We'll dive deep into the nature of temptation, the roots of desire, and the practices that can help us cultivate a pure mind. We'll learn about the Buddhist understanding of the mind and how to apply these teachings in our daily lives. And through this exploration, we will uncover the tools and wisdom necessary to navigate the challenges of modern life without losing ourselves to the chaos. So, let's take a deep breath together and step onto this path. A path not of perfection but of progress. A path of patience, of mindfulness, and of unwavering commitment to the true self. Are you ready? Let's begin. Temptation. It's a word that carries weight. It evokes images of desires we can't resist, the pull of things that seem so tantalizing, yet often leave us feeling empty once we've succumbed. Temptation comes in many forms, some subtle, others blatant. But no matter how it manifests, one thing is certain. It has the power to shape our thoughts, our actions, and ultimately our lives. But why is temptation so powerful? Why do we find ourselves chasing after things we know won't bring us lasting happiness? The answer lies in the nature of the mind itself. At its core, the mind is like a vast ocean, ever-changing, shifting with waves of thought, emotion, and desire. It's constantly moving, never still. And within this sea of thoughts, there exists a deep current, a force that pulls us toward things that promise pleasure, satisfaction, and fulfillment. This current is the root of all temptation. In Buddhist philosophy, this current is closely tied to what we call the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the three primary forces that cloud the mind and fuel our desires. Greed is the craving for more material things, more status, more pleasure. Hatred is the aversion to what we dislike or fear, anger, resentment, judgment. And delusion is the ignorance that prevents us from seeing things as they truly are, the inability to understand the impermanent, interconnected nature of existence. Together, these poisons create a storm within the mind, a storm that makes us chase after fleeting pleasures, pursue goals that don't bring true happiness, and act out of fear or anger rather than wisdom and compassion. It's a cycle that leads to suffering both for ourselves and others. Imagine for a moment a beautiful fruit hanging on a tree. It looks so tempting, its color is vibrant, its shape perfect. You can almost taste its sweetness just by looking at it. But what you don't see is that the fruit is poisoned. If you take a bite, it will bring only pain, illness, and regret. Yet despite knowing this, the temptation is so strong that you can't help but reach for it. This is the nature of the mind. We are drawn to things that promise satisfaction, but often they lead us into suffering. The root of this behavior lies in the ignorance or delusion of the mind. We are often unaware of the true nature of things. We perceive the fruit as something desirable, something that will bring us joy, but we fail to see the underlying truth. In the same way, we pursue desires in life without understanding their true impact. We chase after money, success, fame, or pleasure, thinking they will bring us happiness, but they often leave us feeling empty. This is where Buddhism offers us profound insight. Buddhism teaches us that true happiness cannot be found in external things. It is not found in possessions, achievements, or fleeting pleasures. True happiness arises from understanding the nature of the mind and breaking free from the cycle of craving and aversion. In the Buddhist worldview, temptation is not just an external force that acts upon us. It is an internal process, rooted in the way we perceive the world. The mind, when clouded by greed, hatred, and delusion, becomes like a distorted lens through which we see reality. We grasp at things we think will bring us happiness, but in reality, they only lead to suffering. So how do we free ourselves from this cycle? How do we break the grip of temptation and see things as they truly are? The first step is awareness. We must become mindful of our thoughts, feelings, and desires. When a temptation arises, we must pause and observe it, not with judgment or resistance, but with curiosity and understanding. We must ask ourselves, why do I feel this urge? What is the deeper need behind this desire? Is this thing truly going to bring me lasting happiness, or is it just a fleeting pleasure? Mindfulness is the key that allows us to step back and observe the workings of the mind without getting caught up in them. It creates a space between stimulus and response, a space in which we can make a choice. Instead of reacting impulsively to temptation, we can choose to respond with wisdom and clarity. In Buddhism, this practice of mindfulness is closely tied to the cultivation of right understanding, the ability to see things as they really are. We begin to recognize that all things are impermanent, that they arise and pass away in a constant flow. We see that the things we crave are not permanent sources of happiness, but temporary experiences that come and go. And with this understanding, we can begin to detach ourselves from our desires. Let's take the example of a simple craving, say, for food. When we feel hunger, the mind might start to race. I need food, I want food, I deserve food now. But if we pause and bring awareness to the craving, we begin to see it for what it truly is. The desire is just a thought, a fleeting impulse. It's not an inherent part of who we are. It is a passing sensation, a ripple in the ocean of the mind. As we practice mindfulness, we begin to see that this is true not just for cravings, but for all temptations. Whether it's the desire for wealth, recognition, or pleasure, we start to recognize that these desires are transient. They come and go, like waves in the ocean. We don't have to be swept away by them. This is the essence of Buddhist wisdom, understanding that attachment to desires is what causes suffering, not the desires themselves. Temptation only becomes problematic when we grasp onto it, when we believe that it will bring us lasting happiness. But when we see through this illusion, we are free to let go. We are free to experience life without being enslaved by our desires. The more we practice mindfulness and cultivate right understanding, the more we learn to navigate the world without being controlled by temptation. We learn to live in harmony with the flow of life, without clinging to what is temporary or fleeting. But here's the thing, this is not a one-time fix. It's an ongoing practice. The nature of the mind is such that new temptations, new desires will always arise. But with each moment of mindfulness, we become more skilled at recognizing them for what they are, at letting go, and at returning to a state of peace and clarity. In the next chapter, we'll explore the three primary forces, greed, hatred, and delusion, and dive deeper into their impact on the mind. We'll see how these poisons affect our behavior and how we can begin to transform them, step by step, through the practice of mindfulness and wisdom. But for now, reflect on this. Temptation is not something that exists out there in the world, waiting to trap us. It's something that arises within the mind, shaped by our desires, fears, and ignorance. And the moment we recognize this, the moment we step back and observe, we begin to free ourselves from its grip. As we continue on our journey to understand the nature of temptation, we arrive at a pivotal point. The roots that nourish this perpetual cycle of desire, distraction, and suffering. These roots are deeply ingrained in the human experience, shaping not only our desires but also our behavior, our decisions, and our relationships. In Buddhism, these roots are known as the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the fundamental forces that cloud the mind, turning it away from clarity, peace, and wisdom. Just as a poison corrupts the body, these three poisons contaminate the mind, leading us further into suffering and confusion. Understanding these poisons is essential if we are to free ourselves from the grasp of temptation and regain control over our minds. Let's dive deeper into each of these poisons, starting with greed. Greed is the insatiable craving for things: money, success, pleasure, possessions, recognition. It's the belief that happiness lies in having more. We chase after the next bigger thing, whether it's a material possession or an experience that promises to satisfy us. But the more we acquire, the more we want. It's a cycle that never ends, always leaving us feeling unsatisfied and restless. At its core, greed arises from the belief that we are incomplete, that we need external things to fill the void inside us. We often equate happiness with the possession of something, whether it's a new car, the latest gadget, or a dream vacation. But the truth is, the satisfaction these things bring is fleeting. They offer momentary pleasure, but once the novelty fades, we find ourselves chasing after the next thing, convinced that it will bring us lasting fulfillment. This craving for more is a direct path to suffering. We begin to define ourselves by what we have, how much we own, and how successful we are. Our worth becomes tied to external achievements, leading to anxiety, stress, and a constant fear of losing what we've gained. The mind becomes restless, never at peace, always grasping for the next object of desire. Buddhism teaches us that true happiness does not come from external possessions. It comes from an internal state of contentment, a state that can only be achieved by letting go of our attachment to material things. By cultivating contentment and gratitude for what we already have, we begin to break free from the grip of greed. If greed is the desire for more, hatred is the desire for less, the desire to push away what we don't want. It's the aversion to pain, discomfort, and anything that threatens our sense of peace. Whether it's a person we don't like, a situation we wish would disappear, or a feeling we want to avoid, hatred takes root when we try to escape from these unpleasant experiences. Hatred is the flip side of greed. Where greed makes us crave what we don't have, hatred makes us reject what we do have, especially when it brings discomfort or suffering. It's the constant striving to avoid unpleasantness, to create a life that is free from pain, conflict, and difficulty. But as we all know, such a life is impossible. Life is inherently unpredictable, and pain is a natural part of the human experience. When we give in to hatred, we create division, both within ourselves and with others. We separate ourselves from the world, believing that certain people, situations, or emotions are bad and should be avoided at all costs. This creates a cycle of resistance and struggle, where we are constantly fighting against reality, unable to accept things as they are. In Buddhism, the path to liberation lies in transforming hatred into compassion and acceptance. Instead of rejecting discomfort, we learn to sit with it, to understand its nature, and to respond with kindness and patience. The more we practice compassion, both for ourselves and others, the more we can release the grip of hatred and embrace the world as it is, with all its imperfections. The third poison is delusion, the ignorance or misunderstanding of reality. Delusion is the root of all confusion, the veil that clouds our understanding of ourselves, others, and the world around us. It is the belief that things are permanent when they are not, that they are separate when they are interconnected, and that we are independent when we are interdependent. At its core, delusion is the misunderstanding of impermanence, the idea that all things, whether they are physical or emotional, are temporary. We become attached to things because we believe they will last, but as time passes, we inevitably experience loss, change, and disappointment. Delusion leads us to identify with these impermanent things, believing that our happiness depends on them. We cling to things as if they will never fade, and when they do, we experience suffering. This poison also manifests as the illusion of self, the belief that we are separate from everything else, that we are autonomous individuals in a universe that exists outside of us. We become attached to our sense of self, our ego, and our desires, without realizing that the self is not a fixed, independent entity but a constantly changing process. Buddhism teaches us that the key to liberation is the realization of emptiness, the understanding that nothing has inherent, permanent existence. Everything arises and passes away in a web of interconnectedness. When we let go of our attachment to the self and to the things we think will bring us happiness, we can experience true freedom. These three poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion, are deeply intertwined. They feed off each other, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. Greed makes us want more, hatred makes us want to push things away, and delusion prevents us from seeing the truth of impermanence. Together, they cloud our minds and keep us trapped in the cycle of suffering. But understanding these poisons is not the end of the story. Recognizing their presence within us is the first step in transforming them. Buddhism offers a clear path for purifying the mind and freeing ourselves from these destructive forces. By cultivating the opposite virtues, generosity to counter greed, loving kindness to counter hatred, and wisdom to counter delusion, we begin to transform the mind. The more we practice generosity, compassion, and wisdom, the more we weaken the hold of the three poisons. It's a gradual process, but with consistent effort, we can create a mind that is clear, calm, and free from the grip of temptation. In the next chapter, we will explore how to transform these poisons through mindfulness and meditation, practices that can help us uproot these deep-seated patterns and cultivate a mind that is pure, free, and at peace. When we embark on the path to purifying our minds, meditation stands as the most powerful tool at our disposal. It is more than just a practice of stillness. It is the heart of Buddhist practice, a profound method that enables us to observe, understand, and ultimately cleanse our minds from the poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. As we dive deeper into this chapter, we will explore how meditation serves as the key to purifying the mind and transforming it from a restless, agitated state to one of profound clarity and peace. At first glance, meditation may seem like a simple act of sitting quietly, focusing on the breath, or emptying the mind. But in reality, it is a transformative practice, one that allows us to tap into the deeper layers of our consciousness and unlock a space of peace within. It's in this space that we can finally confront the temptations and distractions that plague our minds, and in turn, purify them. Meditation, at its core, is about mindfulness, being fully present and aware of the moment without judgment or attachment. It is the practice of bringing our attention to the here and now, to what is happening in the mind and body at this very instant. This awareness is not just a fleeting thought. It is a profound, continuous presence that anchors us in reality, keeping us grounded as we navigate the storm of thoughts, emotions, and desires that often overwhelm us. Through mindfulness, we cultivate an awareness of our internal landscape, observing the constant flow of thoughts, feelings, and sensations. This may seem like a simple task, but it requires great discipline and patience. In the beginning, the mind may seem like a whirlwind, constant thoughts racing by, emotions arising without warning, distractions pulling us in every direction. However, with practice, we learn to observe these phenomena without getting caught up in them. We come to realize that thoughts are not who we are. They are simply passing clouds, transient and fleeting. As we begin to witness the patterns of the mind, we also begin to understand the nature of our temptations. Greed, anger, and ignorance arise within us, not because we consciously choose them, but because they are deeply ingrained in the mind. By simply observing these tendencies without judgment, we begin to loosen their grip on us. Meditation gives us the power to observe and transform these habitual reactions, leading us toward freedom. One of the most profound effects of meditation is its ability to help us break free from the cycle of desire. In our daily lives, we are constantly chasing after things, material possessions, status, recognition, pleasure. These cravings can take many forms, but they all stem from the same root: the desire for permanence in a world that is constantly changing. Through mindfulness, we begin to recognize how these desires arise in the mind. They are like waves on the surface of the ocean, constantly appearing and disappearing. But as we meditate, we learn not to be swept away by these waves. We cultivate the ability to sit with the desire without acting on it, without chasing after it. Instead of clinging to the desire, we observe it, allow it to rise and fall, and see it for what it truly is: impermanent, fleeting, and ultimately unsatisfying. As we develop this mindfulness, we begin to experience a shift. The more we practice, the more we realize that true peace doesn't come from acquiring external things, but from letting go of the attachment to them. In this way, meditation helps us purify the mind, allowing us to break free from the endless cycle of craving and find contentment in the present moment. Meditation is particularly effective in purifying the mind because it directly addresses the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion, which are the root causes of all temptations. Through meditation, we are not merely observing thoughts, we are confronting the very forces that cause our suffering and creating the conditions for their transformation. 1. Greed. As we sit in meditation, we begin to observe the endless stream of desires that arise. We notice how often we are drawn toward pleasure, accumulation, or control. But with mindfulness, we develop the capacity to see these desires clearly, without the impulse to act on them. This awareness gradually transforms greed into generosity, not just in terms of material possessions, but in our attitude toward others. We learn to let go of our attachment to what we want and begin to appreciate the simple joys of life, free from the need to possess. 2. Hatred. Meditation also allows us to confront negative emotions like anger, resentment, and hatred. Rather than suppressing these emotions or allowing them to control us, we face them directly with mindfulness and compassion. In doing so, we transform hatred into loving kindness. As we cultivate a heart of compassion for ourselves and others, we begin to see that hatred is born of ignorance of our shared humanity and interconnectedness. Meditation teaches us to soften our hearts, to extend kindness even to those we perceive as enemies, and to embrace all beings with understanding and love. 3. Delusion. The most profound transformation occurs when we confront the poison of delusion, the mistaken belief in a permanent, unchanging self. Through meditation, we gain insight into the nature of impermanence. We begin to see that all things are in a constant state of flux, including our thoughts, emotions, and desires. This insight dissolves the illusion of a fixed identity and opens the door to wisdom, the wisdom that comes from understanding the interconnectedness and impermanence of all things. With this wisdom, we no longer cling to the self, and we are free from the delusions that once kept us trapped in cycles of suffering. Meditation also cultivates the skill of concentration, the ability to focus the mind on a single object of attention. This could be the breath, a mantra, or an object of contemplation. Concentration allows us to steady the mind, making it less susceptible to distraction and more able to see clearly. It is like a magnifying glass. When we focus the mind with clarity and precision, we can discern the deeper truths of our existence. As we practice meditation, we develop the ability to see through the layers of the mind, the surface thoughts, the distractions, and the unconscious patterns that govern our actions. With concentration, we can focus on these layers and break them down one by one until we reach the root of the mind. This deeper insight allows us to address the fundamental causes of our suffering and purify the mind from the inside out. Meditation is a gradual process, and the path to purification is not always easy. At first, the mind may seem unruly and chaotic, and the temptation to give up may arise. But with perseverance, the benefits of meditation begin to unfold. The more we practice, the clearer the mind becomes. The more we cultivate mindfulness and concentration, the more we begin to see the world with fresh eyes, free from the distortion of attachment and aversion. As we purify the mind, we also cultivate qualities such as patience, compassion, and equanimity. These qualities become our natural responses to life, guiding us through the challenges and temptations we face. Through meditation, we learn to respond to situations with wisdom, acting from a place of clarity rather than reacting from old patterns of desire, anger, or ignorance. In time, meditation transforms the very structure of the mind, turning it from a source of turmoil to a wellspring of peace. The more we practice, the more we realize that true freedom lies not in the external world, but in the purity of the mind. Meditation is the key that unlocks this freedom, allowing us to live a life of greater awareness, compassion, and inner peace. In the pursuit of a pure mind, we encounter the guiding light of the Noble Eightfold Path, a fundamental framework in Buddhist practice that illuminates the way to freedom. The Eightfold Path consists of 8 interconnected practices that guide us toward enlightenment. Among these, right view and right intention form the foundation, the very first steps on this transformative journey. These 2 practices shape the way we understand ourselves, our world, and the motivations that drive us. Let's explore how right view and right intention work together to purify the mind, providing the clarity and motivation needed to overcome temptation and achieve lasting peace. The journey toward a pure mind begins with right view, the understanding of the true nature of existence. To purify the mind, we must first free ourselves from the delusions that cloud our perception. In the Buddha's teachings, right view means understanding the 4 noble truths. 1. The truth of suffering, dukkha. Suffering is an inherent part of human existence. It manifests in countless ways: physical pain, emotional anguish, and the inevitable nature of change. The recognition of suffering is not a pessimistic outlook, but a profound acknowledgement of reality. It is the first step toward wisdom. 2. The truth of the cause of suffering, samudaya. Suffering arises from attachment, desire, and ignorance. Our minds are constantly driven by cravings, whether for pleasure, status, or even security. These desires create suffering because they are never truly satisfied. Right view invites us to recognize how these desires cause inner turmoil and conflict. 3. The truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha. The cessation of suffering is possible. By understanding the causes of suffering, we can eliminate them. This is not an abstract idea. It is a practical reality that we can experience through right practice, including mindfulness, meditation, and ethical conduct. 4. The truth of the path to the cessation of suffering, magga. The Noble Eightfold Path is the way to end suffering. It is a path of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline that leads to liberation. When we grasp the right view, we see clearly that the pursuit of external pleasures, wealth, and status will never lead to lasting happiness. This realization shifts our priorities. We begin to understand that true peace comes not from the material world, but from inner cultivation, through the purification of the mind and the reduction of craving. With right view, the illusions of permanence and self-identity dissolve, leaving us with the clarity to see things as they truly are. After gaining the right view, we are called to cultivate the right intention. While right view is about understanding the nature of existence, right intention is about how we respond to this understanding, how we shape our inner motivations, desires, and attitudes. Right intention is the mental aspect of the Eightfold Path. It is the fuel that drives us forward on the path of liberation. There are 3 aspects of right intention. 1. Intention of renunciation, nekkhamma. This is the intention to let go of attachment and craving. It is the understanding that nothing in this world can provide lasting satisfaction. When we live with right intention, we begin to free ourselves from the relentless desire to possess or control. We stop chasing fleeting pleasures, recognizing that true contentment arises from letting go. 2. Intention of goodwill, avyapada. This is the intention to cultivate loving kindness and compassion. In our daily lives, we may encounter situations that trigger anger, frustration, or resentment. Right intention guides us to replace these negative emotions with goodwill, compassion, and understanding. We shift from reacting with hostility to responding with warmth, seeing all beings, ourselves and others, as deserving of love and respect. 3. Intention of non-harming, ahimsa. The third aspect of right intention is non-harming, or the intention to act in ways that cause no harm to others or ourselves. It is the commitment to act with integrity, to practice kindness in speech, thought, and action, and to avoid causing suffering through our words or deeds. Right intention encourages us to live ethically, considering the impact of our actions on the world around us. When right intention becomes our guiding force, we align our inner thoughts and desires with the higher goal of liberation. We develop an attitude of renunciation, goodwill, and non-harming that shapes the way we live. We are no longer driven by self-interest or the pursuit of egoistic desires, but by a deep commitment to virtue, compassion, and peace. Now, we begin to see how right view and right intention serve as powerful tools for purifying the mind. The mind, once clouded by ignorance, is gradually cleared through the wisdom of right view. We understand the nature of suffering and its causes, and we realize that our attachments to the world and its temptations are the very sources of our discontent. With right intention, we reshape our motivations. We consciously choose to let go of harmful desires, to foster goodwill and compassion, and to act in ways that do not harm ourselves or others. This change in intention directly influences our thoughts, words, and actions, leading us toward a life of greater virtue and inner peace. Purification of the mind is not an instantaneous process. It is a gradual unfolding that happens over time, with consistent effort and dedication. Through the practice of right view and right intention, we begin to free ourselves from the grip of temptation. As we purify our minds, we cultivate the capacity to see beyond our desires and attachments. We experience moments of clarity and insight that allow us to break free from the cycle of craving and suffering. These two practices form the foundation of the Eightfold Path. Without the understanding and motivation provided by right view and right intention, it would be difficult to cultivate the other aspects of the path. They give us the wisdom and the inner strength to walk the path with determination, clarity, and compassion. As we move forward, we'll discover how the other elements of the Eightfold Path, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, build upon the foundation laid by right view and right intention. Each step on the path is interconnected, supporting the others in a harmonious progression towards spiritual liberation. But before we get to those practices, we must first understand that right view and right intention serve as the compass that guides us through the twists and turns of life. They provide the moral framework, the mental clarity, and the emotional resilience needed to navigate the temptations of the world and the distractions of the mind. In the pursuit of a pure mind, two qualities stand out as the cornerstones of true spiritual transformation: compassion and wisdom. These two virtues are not merely abstract ideals. They are the practical expressions of a heart and mind that are dedicated to alleviating suffering, our own and that of others. Together, they guide us on the path to liberation, creating a profound shift in the way we engage with the world. In this chapter, we will explore how compassion and wisdom are deeply interwoven with the process of purifying the mind. By cultivating both, we discover the depth of our connection to others and the profound clarity that arises when we see the world through the lens of true understanding. At its core, compassion is the ability to feel for others, to truly care about their well-being and their suffering. But compassion goes beyond mere empathy. It is the active wish that all beings may be free from suffering, and the motivation to act to alleviate that suffering whenever we can. In Buddhism, compassion is not just a fleeting emotion. It is a cultivated state of mind that transforms how we relate to everyone around us. Compassion arises naturally when we realize the interconnectedness of all beings. We come to understand that our suffering is not separate from the suffering of others. In fact, it is intimately connected. In the same way that our own pain arises from attachment and ignorance, so does the pain of others. This realization leads us to right intention, the intention of goodwill, non-harming, and the aspiration to ease the suffering of all. When we practice compassion, it begins to purify our minds. Compassion softens the hard edges of our ego and challenges our tendency toward selfishness. In a world filled with distractions and temptations, compassion reminds us of the greater good and keeps our hearts open. It is impossible to be truly compassionate and to hold onto greed, hatred, or delusion at the same time. Compassion forces the mind to confront its attachments and transforms them into a source of selfless care. The beauty of compassion lies in its expansive nature. It does not discriminate. Compassion extends to all beings, not just those we know or those who have done good by us. It even reaches those who we may consider adversaries or who may cause us harm. When we can look at all beings with compassion, we begin to experience the world in a completely different way. We no longer see the world as a place filled with enemies or obstacles, but as a space where all beings are struggling, just like us, and all deserve our care and understanding. While compassion opens our hearts, wisdom opens our minds. Wisdom is the ability to see the world clearly as it is, without the distortion of our cravings, attachments, and preconceived notions. In the Buddhist tradition, wisdom refers to the deep understanding of the nature of existence, particularly the understanding of the three marks of existence: impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and non-self, anatta. Wisdom is what allows us to see the underlying truth of reality. When we practice wisdom, we come to realize that everything in the world is in a constant state of flux. Nothing lasts forever. The things we chase after, pleasure, success, fame, are temporary. And when we attach ourselves to these fleeting things, we set ourselves up for disappointment. Wisdom enables us to recognize this truth and to let go of our attachments. Wisdom also helps us understand that the self we so often cling to is an illusion. The self is a collection of ever-changing thoughts, emotions, and experiences, not a fixed, permanent entity. When we realize that we are not separate from others, that we are all part of a greater whole, we can let go of the ego-driven desire to protect and glorify me. In doing so, wisdom dissolves the ignorance that keeps us trapped in cycles of craving and aversion. At first glance, compassion and wisdom may seem like separate qualities, but in reality, they are deeply interconnected. Compassion without wisdom can lead to misguided actions. We might help others out of a sense of pity or guilt, rather than a true desire to relieve suffering. We might enable harmful behaviors out of a misplaced kindness. On the other hand, wisdom without compassion can lead to cold detachment. A wise person might understand the impermanence of life, but if they lack compassion, they may become indifferent to the suffering of others. Wisdom without compassion can lead to an intellectual understanding of the truth, but without the warmth of compassion, it lacks the power to transform the heart. When compassion and wisdom come together, they create a balanced approach to life. Compassion opens our hearts to the suffering of others, and wisdom gives us the clarity to know how to act in a way that truly alleviates that suffering. Compassion without wisdom can lead to misguided actions. Wisdom without compassion can make us indifferent. But when they are united, they create a force of transformation that purifies the mind and guides us toward true peace. So, how do we cultivate compassion and wisdom in our daily lives? It begins with small acts of kindness and moments of mindfulness. Every time we interact with others, we have the opportunity to practice compassion. When we encounter suffering, whether in the form of a loved one's pain or the plight of a stranger, we can respond with empathy and care. But compassion alone is not enough. We must also bring wisdom to these moments. When we encounter suffering, we must remember the impermanence of all things, recognizing that this suffering is not eternal. We must remind ourselves that the self we are trying to protect is not as fixed as we believe. And we must practice non-attachment, letting go of our need to control or fix everything. Through this balanced approach, we can act with compassion and wisdom, allowing us to purify the mind. Another way to practice both compassion and wisdom is through meditation. Meditation gives us the space to observe our thoughts and emotions without getting lost in them. Through mindfulness and insight meditation, we can develop a deeper understanding of our own attachments and the suffering they cause. As we become more aware of our inner world, we can learn to respond with compassion and wisdom to our own challenges and to the challenges of others. Ultimately, the path to a pure mind is not about avoiding temptation or denying the challenges of life. It is about transforming the way we relate to these challenges. Compassion and wisdom allow us to see life with clarity and warmth, to understand the causes of suffering, and to respond in ways that are kind, wise, and true. These qualities are not just the antidotes to temptation. They are the foundations of a mind that is free from attachment, free from ignorance, and free from suffering. As we cultivate compassion and wisdom, we move closer to the purity of mind that the Buddha spoke of, an awakened mind that is peaceful, clear, and free. The mind, once clouded by the storms of desire, anger, and confusion, becomes still, calm, and radiant with understanding. This is the path to liberation. This is the path to purity. As we draw this exploration to a close, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a vast and transformative journey, a journey toward a mind free from the entanglements of greed, hatred, and delusion. This path, as we have discovered, is neither quick nor easy, but it is profoundly rewarding. The road to a pure mind is a process of continual self-discovery, conscious effort, and deep inner work. Throughout this journey, we've encountered the nature of temptation, the roots of all suffering, and the tools of the Buddhist path that can help us purify our minds. We've delved into the essential principles of meditation, the profound impact of cultivating right view and right intention, and how compassion and wisdom serve as twin pillars that support us in overcoming our internal obstacles. But above all, we've learned that the journey toward a pure mind is not about perfection. It is about progress, small steps that over time lead to profound shifts in our awareness, actions, and intentions. Each moment of mindfulness, each act of compassion, and each insight gained through meditation brings us one step closer to liberation, to the peace that lies beyond the grasp of fleeting temptations. It's important to remember that this journey is not a destination. It is a continuous unfolding of the mind and heart. Just as a river, though it may change course, never ceases to flow, so too does the path toward a pure mind remain dynamic and ongoing. There will always be challenges to face, temptations to overcome, and moments of doubt along the way. The mind will always need tending, just like a garden that must be regularly weeded and nourished. The difference, however, is that the more we practice, the less these distractions will pull us away from our true nature. The more we cultivate compassion and wisdom, the more we begin to see through the veil of illusion that keeps us entangled in desires and attachments. Slowly but surely the fog lifts, and the mind becomes clearer, more spacious, and more at peace. Temptation, we've learned, is not something that can be avoided or suppressed. It is an inevitable part of human existence. The key to overcoming temptation is not through resistance, but through understanding. When we see temptation for what it truly is, momentary and fleeting, we can hold it lightly. We can recognize that it is a natural part of the world, but not something that defines us. Temptation arises from our attachments to things that are impermanent, and the more we cultivate wisdom, the more we come to realize the futility of clinging to them. A pure mind is not a mind that is free from desire. It is a mind that is free from the attachment to desire. It is a mind that sees desire, acknowledges it, and then lets it go. This is the essence of non-attachment, the ability to engage with the world without being enslaved by it. Meditation remains the most powerful tool we have for purifying the mind. Through regular meditation practice, we gain direct access to the workings of our mind. We begin to see the patterns of thought and emotion that bind us to the cycle of craving and aversion. Meditation allows us to observe our mind with detachment, to see how fleeting our desires are, and to cultivate the space between stimulus and reaction. In meditation, we learn to return to the present moment, again and again, whenever the mind begins to wander or become agitated. In this way, meditation is both a tool and a refuge, allowing us to ground ourselves in the present and reconnect with the peace that lies within us. Through meditation, we not only purify the mind but also unlock the wisdom that lies dormant within. Perhaps the most essential lesson on the path to a pure mind is the realization that compassion and wisdom must always go hand in hand. Without compassion, wisdom can become cold and detached. Without wisdom, compassion can become misguided or even harmful. Together, they create a holistic approach to life, one that brings healing to both ourselves and others. As we move through our daily lives, we must remember that every act of kindness, no matter how small, is a step toward a purer mind. Every moment of insight gained through wisdom, whether in meditation or through reflection, brings us closer to liberation. These two qualities, cultivated in balance, form the foundation of a mind that is unshaken by the storms of desire and free from the pull of worldly distractions. The beauty of the path to a pure mind is that it is not reserved for monks or ascetics alone. It is for everyone. It is not about renouncing the world, but about engaging with it in a way that is wise, compassionate, and free from attachment. It is about living a life that reflects the deep understanding that all things are impermanent, that all beings are interconnected, and that the true source of happiness lies not in external conditions, but in the purity of our own minds. As we continue to walk this path, we will undoubtedly encounter challenges. There will be moments of doubt, times when we feel discouraged, or when temptation seems too powerful to resist. But remember, these are the very moments that offer us the greatest opportunity for growth. It is through these moments that we deepen our practice, refine our understanding, and move closer to the purity that lies at the heart of our being. A pure mind is a mind that is free. Free from the tyranny of cravings, free from the weight of negative emotions, and free from the illusions that have kept us trapped for so long. It is a mind that is at peace with itself and the world around it. It is a mind that has the clarity to see things as they truly are, and the compassion to act in ways that alleviate suffering. In the end, the journey towards a pure mind is a journey towards freedom. It is a journey that requires patience, discipline, and self-compassion. But it is also a journey that leads to the deepest kind of happiness, a happiness that comes not from the external world, but from the inner peace that arises when we let go of the illusions that have kept us bound. As we close this chapter, remember, the path to a pure mind is yours to walk. Every step you take, no matter how small, is a step toward liberation. Keep your heart open, your mind clear, and your intentions pure. And in time, you will find that the true nature of the mind is not temptation or desire, but peace, clarity, and boundless compassion. The journey continues.